Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see all of you here this morning. I want to thank you for the steadily increasing compliance to the sitting in the middle two sections request. I appreciate that. I know that it is not easy to jolt yourself out of the routine, but I really think it does make for a better Bible class. Before we actually launch into the text, is there anybody here who would like a book and does not have one? If so, please raise your hand. Want a book and do not have one? Doug will be around and Doug will get those to you. I realized the first week that I couldn't do it myself, so I'm steadily increasing in my understanding here, which I guess is good. All right. Now that we have all of those things dealt with, I guess we can actually turn our attention to the Word. Before we do, Brother Dennis, would you mind leading us in prayer? Amen. Thank you, Dennis. As most of you probably remember, I was out of town last Sunday morning. I was preaching at Brentwood. And so Shawn covered my class for me. Thank you very much, brother. And he told me that you managed to get through Romans 2, which puts us on question 8 on page 5 of our lesson books. So without further ado, let's get things rolling there. The question says, what two rhetorical questions does Paul ask in 3:1? In 3:2, how does he answer them? What does this mean? According to verses 3 through 6, does the Jews' unrighteousness nullify the righteousness of God? Why or why not? In 3:7 and 8, what two slanderous statements does Paul identify? And what does this show us about whether anyone can avoid glorifying God? So, let's start by reading this, actually. Who wants to read Romans 3:1 through 8, just the first 8 verses of that text? Any volunteers? Romans 3. Mike, read away, brother. Right. Thank you very much, brother. All right, so two rhetorical questions that Paul starts this section off with. What are they? What do we see in verse 1 there? We'll notice, I think, as we go through Romans, that Paul likes to use rhetorical questions to advance his argument. This is another place where that happens. What does he ask? Exactly. This is carrying right over from the tail end of Romans 2. That if you'll recall, the chapter breaks are not part of the autograph here, that Paul did not put in the chapter breaks. And there are a lot of places in Romans where they will really chop up the flow of the argument. So we need to remember that Paul has just said, you have all these Jews who are condemned too because they have the law and they don't keep it. So obviously the question in a lot of Jewish minds is going to be, well then, what's the whole point of having the law? And that's exactly why Paul is raising the question here. What's the answer to the question? Is there an advantage to being a Jew? Is there an advantage to having the ritual of circumcision? Is that what it says? Yes, it says much in every way, that there is an advantage. So that being the case, what does he say the advantage is? Exactly right. Let's put it like this. In Romans 1, we see the Gentiles engaging in blindfolded target practice. They have this moral sense of what they're supposed to do, but they don't have the law of God. And so they're really shooting at a target that they can't see. What Paul says in verse 2 here is that by contrast, the Jews are shooting at a target that they can see. It helps a whole lot if you're trying to live up to God's expectations to know exactly what those expectations are. So, how did the Jews do at this, though? Did any of them succeed in perfectly keeping the law even though they knew it? No, they did not. They failed usually pretty dramatically. So then that brings us to our next question. According to verses 3 through 6, does this nullify the righteousness of God? Does the fact that the Jews blew it mean that God wasn't doing them a favor and giving them his law? No. And why or why not? Why does the Jews' unrighteousness not make God unrighteous? Because he is going to judge us in the end. And I think even more than that, whose failure are we talking about here? Yes, it is the failure of the humans. It is the failure of the Jews. God did what God ought to have done. He behaved justly. And so, because of that, the failure of people to keep his law does not show that he has somehow been unrighteous. So in verses 7 and 8, what two slanderous statements does Paul identify? What's the rhetorical question in verse 7? Yes, that if my unrighteousness shows God's righteousness, then how come I am being condemned for being unrighteous? And what similar question shows up in verse 8? Yeah, why not do evil so that good comes? And that follows right off from that previous statement, that God's righteousness is still revealed against the backdrop of the unrighteousness of humankind. So then, why don't we all just be unrighteous so that God's righteousness is shown more and more? And for that matter, if my unrighteousness is showing God's righteousness, then why am I being condemned for it when it has this good effect? So what does Paul think of those ideas? Does he say that that's a good way to think? In fact, what does he say about the people who say this? What is going to happen to them at the end of verse 8? Yes, that they are going to be justly condemned. So what does this show us then about whether anybody can avoid glorifying God? Is that possible for us as God's creation to avoid glorifying him? Yes, we have a responsibility in this life. We're accountable for that. But even for just the most wretched atheist out there, is that somebody who ultimately can avoid glorifying God? No, he won't, because like it says in Philippians 2, that every knee is going to bow, every tongue is going to confess. And there the image is of God as this victorious king. And then you have all these captives from the enemy army that are going to glorify God by their submission beneath his feet. So the reality is, friends, that every one of us, every one of everybody, all of us are going to glorify God. We're going to glorify him either by showing his greatness as we serve him, or we are going to glorify him as we show his greatness as he overcomes us and defeats us and destroys us as his enemies. Yeah, that's a grim thing to think about, that here you have this man who spent his whole life arguing for not very good reasons that there was no God, and then once it is too late for him to do anything about it, he discovers his error. The day is going to come when everybody is going to see Stephen Hawking and every other great opponent of the faith glorify God too. And I take no pleasure in the fate of men like that, but it still reveals who is truly great, and that no one can hope to oppose God and be victorious. Any other thoughts or comments before we go on? Okay, then, let's look at verses 9 through 20. Who wants to read that? Romans 3, 9 through 20. Landon. Right. So, our question for this hunk of text asks, what conclusion does Paul reach in verse 9? In 10 through 18, how does he justify this? According to 19 and 20, what is the spiritual effect of the law? Why? And why is Paul making this point? So, what's the conclusion then in verse 9? Yes. Everybody is under sin. The Jews are not better off, even though they had the law, and that's a great advantage. They still didn't keep it. They didn't capitalize on their advantage. And how does he justify this in verses 10 through 18? How does he support this claim that everybody is under sin, the Jew as well as the Greek? What's going on in, what cue do we have about what's going on at the very beginning of verse 10? What's that? None is righteous, no, not one. But even before that, right at the very beginning of the verse, it says something. Yes, this is a quotation. And in a lot of our Bibles, all of this is set off. I think that the NAS, for instance, will put it all in small caps to indicate that what Paul is doing here is quoting from the Old Testament. And who are all of these quotations talking about? Because this is Jews. This is a big, strung together list of condemnations throughout the Old Testament that are describing God's own people. This is who they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be following the law. This is who they actually are. So then, in verses 19 and 20, what is the spiritual effect of the law and why? Especially at the end of verse 19, we see what the actual result of the law of Moses is in practice. Yes, specifically, my translation says, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. Because even if God's own people want to cry out and say, God, you have no right to condemn us, then God is able to say, no, I told you to do this and this and this, and you did none of it. You failed. And why is this true? What does verse 20 explain about the way that the law operates? Does the law actually justify anybody? No. Why? What's the problem? Why does the law fail to justify? Yes, it is exactly what Paul says, is that since through the law comes a knowledge of sin. We talked earlier in the chapter about the advantage of having the law. We see the target that we're shooting at. We know the standard that we're supposed to live up to if we are a Jew. But the problem is, if I know that I am supposed to do X, but I do Y instead, then what is my knowledge doing for me? Yes, exactly right. That I am condemned by my own understanding. And so even though the law theoretically could be a path to righteousness, and it was for Jesus, because Jesus kept all of these things perfectly, for all of the other Jews, in practice, the more they knew the law, the more they understood how far short they fell. And isn't that true for us today? Because what happens the more we understand God's Word? Does that usually make us feel better and better about ourselves, and we start thinking, wow, I'm a really good person. I'm doing all of this exactly right. Is that what happens when we study more and more? Charlie? Exactly right. That is my own impression. In our private studies throughout the week, Shawn and I have been going through 1 John. And John's big thing in 1 John is to talk about love. And Shawn and I, we've been coming away from these studies saying, man, John is really sticking it to us. Because it is so easy for us to fall short of the standard of the love of God and Christ. And that's the sort of thing that ought to humble us, to make us recognize I am not going to justify myself by being a good person. Because when I compare myself to what God is actually asking, then I see that there are a lot of ways in which I fall short. Shawn? Yes, I agree that the Jews definitely became arrogant as or at least people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees that we see in the New Testament. They were arrogant because they thought they could rely on the law. And it's very interesting because when the Pharisees and the Sadducees were evaluating themselves against the law, Did they do so by considering the full law and being honest about what the full law revealed about them? I see head shaking, and the head shakers are correct. Charlie? I think that's true, that it actually worked in both directions. That on the one hand, Jesus says of them that you're tithing the herbs out of your garden, while you're neglecting the weightier matters of the law. You're neglecting justice and mercy and faithfulness. That they forgot the reasons why they were supposed to be doing those things, but they focused so much on the minutia that they created more minutia to focus on to make themselves feel justified. That they basically reduced themselves to checklist believers. And they added more items to their checklist while ignoring the parts of the law that would condemn them.
It also seems to me that it's a matter of what comparison you're going to use, because if I'm a Pharisee and I compare myself to a Gentile, then, and that's what I think matters, then it would be natural for me to feel very good about myself. The same thing today, if I attend worship service and I read and I pray and I compare myself to someone who doesn't do all those things, then I should feel very good about myself. But that's not what matters to God. God has a different expectation. If I compare myself to the Word and to Jesus, then the more I learn, the greater the gap that I'm aware of between who I am and who God would have me to be.
I think that's exactly right. For those of you who maybe couldn't hear, what Landon said is that a lot of the problem comes when we start using the people around us as our standards rather than using the perfection of the law of God as our standards. And it is certainly true that the Pharisees did that, because what do we see in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector? We've been studying together too long, brother.
The Pharisee says, I'm not, thank God I like this guy over here.
Exactly it.
I pray, I do this, I do that. And he thought he was such a great person.
Yes.
He was comparing himself to another person.
Yes, he thought he was so wonderful because he wasn't a tax collector. He wasn't scum like that dude over there. Jack? Yes, that what Jack said is that there are certainly applications here for us, even though I don't think that Paul is directly talking about us here. That just like the Jews fell into this danger of checklist, so we can fall into the same danger of checklist. Do I worship at a building that says Church of Christ on the sign out front? Check. Is the auditorium free of instruments of music? Check. So that means that I am doing everything that God wants me to do. And, I think that God is indifferent to signs. I think that God does care that we sing praises to Him. But if we think that by fulfilling one commandment, we're somehow doing everything that we should, when stuff like justice and mercy and faithfulness is hovering over us, then that's when we show we don't really get it either. You have a comment, Joe? Absolutely. I think that is true too. What Joe said is that it is important to recognize the contribution that our pride in ourselves can make toward division. And certainly we see that everywhere. People who think that they're doing well enough, and this is true in the brotherhood, it's true outside of the brotherhood, that they can't get along with one another because they aren't approaching serving God with the humility, with the understanding of God's grace that they should. Harvey? Absolutely, that we can become arrogant because of our spiritual situation, our relationship with God, just as the Jews became arrogant for that same reason. So there are lots of applications to us, but let's go back to the original context here. Why is Paul making this point? Why is he emphasizing that Jews cannot justify themselves according to the law? Yes, that he is continuing to build his argument that we cannot justify ourselves. We need someone else to justify us. But why is Paul focusing so much on the law? Why is he focusing so much on circumcision? Why does he spend all of this time talking specifically about the shortfalls of the law of Moses? There's a reason, and I think it's a very important reason for our understanding of the argument of Romans. They were using their works to be justified. And what particular species of people looking to be justified by works is Paul all throughout his ministry concerned about? He's concerned about the Jew. I think that is exactly right. That this is about the issue of Judaizing false teachers. And what particular act is sort of the flashpoint for that biblical disagreement? Yes, circumcision. This is about binding the law of Moses on Gentile converts. It is especially about circumcision. And we tend to read through it because circumcision is not a religious issue for us today. But Paul talks about circumcision in Romans 2. He talks about circumcision in Romans 3. He talks about circumcision in Romans 4. And the reason is because he is explaining all of this about justification through faith in Christ in order to rebut the argument that in order to become a Christian, you also had to be a Jew. He is trying to emphasize to his Gentile audience that no, you should not receive circumcision, because once you receive circumcision, you are setting your feet on this path of justification by works. So, let's continue to keep our eye on that. Continue to recognize that all the way through this, Paul is concerned with these Judaizing false teachers. He's concerned with explaining to the people of his time that they do not have to be circumcised in order to be saved, and here's why. And so when we see this discussion of faith and works in Romans 4, for works, we always need to put of the law in parentheses, and especially we need to be thinking about circumcision. And once we do that, then I think a lot of the problems with false teaching through here will resolve themselves. Anybody else? Charlie? Absolutely. And I think you see the same problem with the Pharisees as with many of the human religions around us. That you have all of these people who are interested in adding extra works. They're going beyond the witness of God's Word in an attempt to justify themselves. All right then, let's move on to lesson 3 then. Who wants to read verses 25 through 26 of Romans 3? You will notice that my lessons do not follow the chapter breaks. I think the chapter break between Romans 3 and Romans 4 is terrible, for instance. Who wants to read verses 21 through 26? Any volunteers? All right, read it, Shawn. Right. Thank you, brother. So, question 1. What contrasting observation does Paul make in Romans 3:21? According to 3:22 through 24, how does this work? What does Paul reveal in verses 25 and 26 about God's part in this? Why did God do this? And what does this teach us about the seriousness of sin? So, we saw that the law brings the knowledge of sin. The law manifests sin. What contrasting observation shows up in verse 21? Yes, that now apart from the law, God's righteousness has been revealed. That we can be righteous through God. And how does this work? How is it possible that even though we are sinners, that God's righteousness can be manifested to us and in us? Yes, through faith in Jesus. And how does that work? Why is it that faith in Jesus can reveal God's righteousness in us? Verses 25 and 26 especially. What is it that Jesus did so that through faith in Him we could have this grace, that God could favor us even though we do not deserve to be favored? Yes, that God put Jesus forward, it says, as a propitiation by His blood. What does it mean to propitiate somebody? Not a word we normally use. It's in the right, pay for it is in the right direction. What else might, let's see if we can be more specific. What is propitiation? Again, generally true, but I think there is a specific meaning to the word. What are we doing when we propitiate somebody? Carol? It's an atoning sacrifice, and underlying that, I think there's another, what's that? Satisfaction of a debt, closer still. I think it's especially the idea of turning away somebody's wrath. That if somebody is really angry then you can go to them and you can propitiate them. You can give them something that will calm them down. You can settle them down. That is how you propitiate somebody. That what is at stake here is that the offering of Jesus turned aside God's wrath. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. It is turning aside our condemnation. And let's dig into that a little more. Is, this being tax season, let's talk about taxes. Is God's attitude towards sin like the IRS's attitude toward those who don't pay their taxes? Because do you think that if the IRS agent somewhere discovers that you have not paid the taxes that you should, is he really emotionally invested in that, or is this just another day on the job for him? Yeah, Kathy says, just another day on the job, and I think that's exactly right. But is that God's attitude toward our sin, that he's just going to condemn us unemotionally like that IRS agent? Well, they sinned, I guess that I'm going to have to condemn them. Is that God's attitude? Yes. He loved us enough to save us despite our sin. But if we choose to remain in those sins, then what is God's attitude toward us? Well, he is going to punish us, but is he going to punish us like the IRS agent? Or is there more emotional involvement in that than there is with the IRS agent?
For God, it's personal. And the comment over there about his love, his love is like the opposite of his feeling with regards to sin. He loved us enough, he cares about us enough to sacrifice his own son. When we sin, imagine, the toll that has on him, because it's a rejection of him and everything that he's done for us. It's like when your children disappoint you. All the emotional investment, all the time that you put into him, he created us, and yet we reject him.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That for God, sin is a very, very personal matter. That one of the great metaphors of the Old Testament is God comparing the rebellious Israel to a wife that becomes a prostitute and is utterly unfaithful to her husband. This crops up over and over again in the prophets. And, if you're the husband in that situation, that you brought your wife up from nothing, you give her everything she needs, you provide richly for her, you love her, you care for her, and then she gets out and she cheats on you with everybody that she can find. How are you going to feel about that? Devastated. You'll be crushed. You'll be hurt. And I think there's another part of that recipe too. Yes, very, very angry. And I think that is where we see part of the masculine nature of God. That God is a jealous God. God is furious with those who defy him. And ultimately, it is only Jesus who could be put forward as this propitiation to turn aside God's wrath at our unfaithfulness to what he wants from us.
In Shawn's Wednesday night class, we'll eventually get to probably the best example of how we can understand this, where God confronts Moses with what the children of Israel have done, and essentially says to Moses, stand aside, and I'm going to go down there and wipe them out, and I'll start over with you. And Moses says no, and basically stands in between God and the people and pleads for them. And that's what Jesus, through his death, and now as he intercedes for us, does for us. He stands between us and God and pleads our case, and is the only one who can stop God from giving us what we deserve.
I think that is exactly right. We don't understand, I think, just how wrathful God is about sin, how much it hurts him, how much it angers him. And looking, I guess, at the last question here, what does this teach us about the seriousness of sin? What can we learn about sin simply from the fact that the Son of God was the propitiation? What does that tell us? That Jesus was the sacrifice that God used to pay that debt.
It tells me that God sees serious business. It's very different than our culture would say, today. Not really a big deal. It is so serious that the only way the penalty would be paid was God's perfect Son out of the cross.
Exactly right. We know that God loved and loves his Son more than we can imagine. And so for God to take Jesus, who is so utterly precious to him, and send Jesus to earth to suffer and die while God looks on and does nothing, there is nothing more that God conceivably could have done to pay the price for our sin. And I think if God could have done less, he would have done it. Because who of us would stand by and watch one of our children die if there were any way to prevent that? Any other option, any other alternative? Wouldn't we explore all those other alternatives first? Go down every path that would be sufficient other than that. And yet God knew that nothing else but the sacrifice of Jesus could do. Jack? I think that is right. That all the way through this, we've been emphasizing God's emotional response, God's wrath, God's love. And that tells us, too, that our response to sin should also be emotional, that we should mourn over sin. And in fact, all of these things fit together. Because there are people who like to maximize the love of God while minimizing the seriousness of sin and the depth of God's wrath caused by sin. But the problem is that logically those things, they move in tandem. Because what these people are actually arguing for is the idea that God really, really loves us. And we see that he sent his Son, and that shows his love. But he did this to solve this really insignificant problem. And friends, that doesn't make a lick of sense. Why would God solve such an insignificant problem with an immense sacrifice? If God really wasn't that upset about sin, then why did he send Jesus? Harvey? Yes. And that, of course, is the flip side of what we're talking about. That God, just as the seriousness of our sin and the importance of Christ's sacrifice go together, so do God's wrath and God's love. God is never indifferent to us. And so, just as he is so badly hurt and angered by our sin, yet he still yearns for us, and yearns for us so much that he was willing to give the most precious thing he had. I don't know about the rest of you, but I have never had an IRS agent pay my taxes for me. Didn't happen. And yet, that's what God has done for us. Precisely because he loves us. Anything else on this issue? I think that is exactly right. That what Charlie said is that Jesus is the last opportunity for the human race. And let's think about that in terms of the wronged husband imagery again. That here God created the human race, but ever since the beginning they've been unfaithful to him. He loves them, but they've hurt him, they've betrayed him. Over and over again, they have demonstrated that they cannot be trusted. And yet God says, I love all of you enough that I'm going to give you one more chance. And I'm going to give you this one more chance at terrific cost to myself. And I'm going to give everybody the opportunity to make things right with me through this precious opportunity. And that's where all of us are. We are on the last chance. And if we turn aside from that last chance, then can any of us blame God for pouring out his wrath on those who have so stubbornly refused him? I mean, from God's perspective, what else can you do? Any other thoughts? All right, let's go on to question 2. Try to squeeze one more in. According to 3:27 through 30, how does this affect the boastful Jew of 2:17? In 3:31, what question does this raise? How does Paul answer it? How does he defend his answer? In 4:1 through 5. Why is it important to recognize that Paul here is talking about the law of Moses and not all law generally? So, who wants to read Romans 3:27 through Romans 4:1 through 5? Any volunteers? Romans 3:27 through 4:1 through 5. Dan. All right, thank you, Dan. So, we've been talking about being justified by faith through the sacrifice of Jesus. According to the first several verses here, how does justification through faith in Jesus affect the boastful Jew of 2:17? Does anybody who is justified by faith in Jesus have any grounds for boasting, any grounds for pride? No, not at all. It is excluded. And what question then does this raise in verse 31? If we are justified apart from the works of the law, nobody has reason for boasting in their perfect keeping of the law, what question shows up in verse 31? Yes. Are we somehow undermining the law through faith? Are these competing systems of justification somehow? How does Paul answer this? Is this actually overthrowing the law of Moses to say that we're justified by faith apart from the works of the law? He says no. And how does he defend this answer? Who does he point to? In the first 5 verses of Romans 4. Yes, that Abraham was justified. Was Abraham justified by works? He was justified by faith. And so there, I guess we need to wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. Good class.